It's that time. It's time for part 3 of our GR86 Living With series. This is the episode where we talk about modification, putting suspension and brakes, and walking you through what this car is like to drive when you dump nearly $6,000 worth of suspension into a vehicle. But before we talk about that, let's get some housekeeping out of the way. How has this car been like to live with over the last 11,000 miles? I bought this thing in January. It's currently December, so I've almost owned this thing for a year. When it comes to fuel economy, I know that's a boring statistic, but this car has averaged 22.8 miles per gallon. That is including track driving, city driving, highway driving, and overall commuting. That is my entire lifetime mileage. On the highway, it doesn't matter what tire you're running, at about 80 miles an hour, you get between 23 and 24 miles per gallon. In the city, you get between 18 and 19, at least during my kind of driving. Here in the Midwest, the Chicagoland area, we are blessed with forgiving speed limits. On the highway, you're essentially sitting at 80 miles an hour the entire time, which is a godsend. What about reliability? Well, the primary question I get is, what about the RTV buildup? It's an issue that has plagued this car essentially since its launch. So what does that mean, and what is that problem if you are unfamiliar with it? So essentially, when Subaru assembles the engine for this car, doesn't matter if you get the Toyota or the Subaru variant of the 86, the engine is still built by Subaru. And in typical Subaru fashion, they don't do the best job with, let's call it QC of their RTV. So RTV is a sealant or a gasket sealant that they use between the oil pan and the engine. Essentially, some of that RTV breaks off and makes its way into the oil pan and then the oil pickup. Well, we went to AFA Performance to see if this was a real problem. We took a car with a similar VIN. Amir, a viewer of ours, was kind enough to lend us his essentially strictly track 86, which was purchased at the same dealer at the same time as my car. It's the same basic vehicle. It's a premium blue GR86 in manual, and he has about 3,000 miles on it, all track. We dropped his oil pan at AFA, and we found RTV. In fact, quite a bit of it. Some in the oil pan, but quite a bit of it in the oil pickup. So what issue is that potentially causing? So essentially what people are saying is all of this RTV in the oil pickup causes oil starvation and then no more engine. Well, I've spoken to both Toyota and people who race these cars. We work frequently with Counterspace Garage. They have a race series built around the 86 Twins. They've been working on these cars since the very beginning. We worked with them all the way back when Mark had an FRS that he supercharged. So they are genuinely experts on this platform. When you speak to them, they claim they have not seen any direct failures that can be directly attributed to the RTV buildup. Well, they have seen failures in this engine. Most of that is related to oiling issues with the oil temps thinning out, oil sloshing side to side, causing oil starvation. They can't directly link the RTV buildup in the oil pickup to engine failures. And if you know anything about oil pickups, while it does look visually bad in this video, you would need a lot more RTV than this to cause a failure. And if Amir's car is any example of that, his car lives essentially its entire life at high load, high G-forces, and he has not seen an engine failure yet with all this RTV. When speaking to Toyota, what they claim is that if it is a real problem that you can directly attribute to engine failures, they will cover it, no questions asked, and that is directly from a Toyota PR person associated with the GR86. Overall, other reliability issues with this car, there are very few. In my car's case, I have a wrinkly steering wheel and a couple rattles here and there in the interior. I've met other people that have had weepy rear differentials and gearboxes, but that is not in the norm. And the other engine failures, again, that I've seen for this car are related to running 0W20 oil, which is a stock oil, which if you run at high temps for a long period of time, have the real likely possibility of thinning out and causing no more engine. When speaking to engine builders, people who are far smarter than I am, people who designed the LT6, the flat plane crank V8 in the C8 Z06, I had a lengthy discussion about oil temps, and they say the same thing that I've heard from other people. There's no reason to run 0W20 in a performance application. You're running with a very thin oil. So God forbid it does thin out. All it takes is half a second for you to skim a bearing and no more engine. So what about modification? Because that's the topic of this video. Well, our philosophy for this build, I hate to call it that, but this process was to see if this car with modifications is better to drive than an S2000, but also keep it entirely livable. We used the S2000 as a template. I wanted to see if this car was going to be faster than that vehicle and more fun to drive using essentially the same parts that are on that vehicle. We have the same Hankook RS4s. We are running a similar tire size. We put the Essex Big Brake Kit, their sprint kit, on this car. It is essentially the same kit on Mark's S2000. We've used Essex AP Big Brake Kits in the past. They are great to work with. They're an engineering company. They're a motorsports company. They aren't about making your car necessarily look better, but perform better. There are a ton of different pad options you can use with the sprint kit. It shaves nearly 20 pounds a corner off the front of this vehicle. However, it does not come with dust boots. So if you are going to drive this in the winter, you run the risk of corrosion. But if you are in the rest of the world where it doesn't salt, I highly recommend this kit. One caveat, depending on what pad you use, if you use a strict track pad, doesn't matter if it's a Ferodo pad or the pads we also use, which are the counter space garage pads, this thing is essentially a tuning fork, so you are going to run with a ton of brake noise. If you swap in a street pad like I did, most of that goes away, which is a godsend. We then used the Öhlins Road and Track coilover kit. It is a more expensive kit. Yes, there are more track capable kits, but they found a perfect balance in our experience between street dampening, so it actually does ride better than stock, and on-track performance. While there's not a dedicated kit out for the GR86 and BRZ, Öhlins worked directly with us to modify their kit to better work with this vehicle, and it's essentially going to be the template for the future Road and Track kit specifically for the GR86. It's running 7K springs front and rear. We worked with them on ride height and all that other fun stuff. The other thing we did was camber plates and camber arms. Sadly, Öhlins does not have their camber plates out. For some reason, they're back ordered. We couldn't get them, and so we went with racing camber caster plates. They essentially look like jewelry. Yes, they make a little bit of noise, which is sort of a pain in the ass, but that's what happens when you go to all spherical, no rubber bushings. And they do translate more NVH to the cabin, but they are a very nice piece, and they do offer a ton of alignment capability at the front of the vehicle. The rear, we are running camber arms provided to us by Counter Space Garage. Again, they are experts on this car, and if you are looking to build your car similarly to this, or if you're just looking for modification advice, they're very, very knowledgeable. They have a technical background, and they know everything you need to know about modifying this car. The rear camber arms are necessary to get alignment in the rear of this vehicle because when you drop this car, you screw everything up essentially. In the rear, we are running -2 degrees of camber. But enough about that, and the install process is pretty straightforward. You've seen it a million times in the past. So let's speak to Britt Casey to talk to you about track performance. We're in the shop with Britt Casey where we're going to discuss some lap times. As a refresher, this is now on an Essex Sprint kit with Counter Space Garage pads. It has the same Hankook RS4 tire as we tested earlier on the same Apex wheels. It has camber plates and the Öhlins Road and Track damper setup, and it's running a -2.5 degree setup of camber in the front, -2 in the back. Compared to the last setup of this car, which was just brake pads, Hankook RS4s, and the Apex wheels, it dropped about 3 seconds. That car ran a 38.9 at Autobahn Country Club. This car now runs a 135.9. Britt Casey was the driver in both cases. The ambient temperatures were basically the same. As if you have not watched all of our other videos, Britt Casey is a IMSA driver. He raced in GT4 and was the TCR champion in 2018. Where did you make up that time, and can you walk me through where the car has improved, like from a dynamic perspective?
So in the third iteration, the biggest time gains were in the brake zone, just how well the car could brake, and then also the mid-corner speed was higher because of the dampers. That's generally what it was.
Let me ask you about brakes. So again, not a race car driver, you are. What do you look for in braking feel and braking confidence? Obviously, the thermal capacity of going to a more race-style brake is greatly increased. You can drive this car for longer on track, but what about in the actual feeling of braking improved, or what are you looking for in a good setup?
Yep, so I like strong initial bite, but not too strong, meaning when you first hit the pedal, it's got to have good bite. Like, it's not going to take a ton of pressure to hit it. And then you're finding out you're not slowing down fast enough, so you add more pressure. You don't want to, also it's more of a comfortability thing, especially for track days. You don't want to like tire your calf out, right? Yep. You know, some guys aren't really used to it as much, and especially if it's your right foot doing all that stuff.
And you're not looking for like an on-off switch. You want a progressive pedal, essentially.
Yep, so on-off switch meaning like softer brake pad compound is harder initial bite, but also less modulation as you kind of decrease brake pressure. So the harder the brake pad is, the wider your range of modulation becomes, if that makes sense.
No, that does. So what about the damper setup? So obviously way more negative camber in the front of your car essentially increases your contact patch more or less. So as you turn the car in, the tire won't roll over as much. Is that just better initial turn-in? Is that the big thing you feel?
Yeah, so because it's a better shock, it's allowing the car to roll more speed. So then the next Achilles heel of each suspension component of the car per corner is probably going to be the bushings. So you just want to guarantee that because you're rolling more speed, there's more force going through the upright, especially on the outside tires. You don't want the tire to fold over, so increasing camber kind of gets it back to its normal usable range on the tire tread.
What in dampers do you look for? Like, what do you feel in a better damper versus like a stock cheaper damper? Now we've gone to the Ohlins versus the stock, I don't know, off the shelf Subaru Toyota damper. What do you feel?
More stability overall. Also, you have a range of adjustment now, so that's a new luxury. But the other part that I think is really more highlighted is you're feeling the road more, and the car is less on edge. It's more confidence inspiring. You're driving on the 4 suspension components that really affect the most parts of it, which is the dampers on the car.
I will say something as well, as you can probably see in the lap times. The thing that's most shocking to me, and I know it's been a long time since you drove the Z and the Supra, but this car, which with all its modifications is probably in the mid-30s or maybe a little higher than that, is almost as fast as a stock Supra on RE71 RSs, which are a much stickier tire than these RS4s. The Supra ran essentially a 35 flat, while this modified ran a 35.9, 35.8. And this is actually faster than the all-new Z on brake pads, brake fluid, and RE71 RSs. I know those cars are like way in the back of your mind. Do you prefer driving this to the Z and the Supra, or like which of those, let's call them these 3 rear-wheel drive Japanese cars, or maybe one of them is more German than Japanese if we're being honest, but which do you prefer driving?
So in its current form, I would say this car, just because it has true track-ready performance on it installed. It's going to do it reliably, and I think you're going to get more skill development and sort of exposure to performance driving when you have a car.
A more momentum car, essentially.
Right. That's also part of it, but I would say just the upgrades alone warrants this car being the best track day car of all of them. You're going to be more sensitive to your mistakes. You're not going to be able to cover them up, and you're going to be able to identify them on track faster when you don't have the power to, or it's really the torque to overcome it.
Yeah, so if you're an idiot like me, this car will penalize you in a way where it's going to force you to hopefully become a better driver.
Right. Right.
So with that, Britt, thank you. And you're going to see Britt in some of our future upcoming comparison tests and track test videos. If you are looking to learn to become a better driver, if you're an Autobahn member, hit up Britt. Winter in a modified 86, Mark.
This sucks.
So clearly this car is on winter tires now. We're not on the Hankook RS4s. It's very cold out, but we're still on the aftermarket suspension and brakes. You've driven this car on the track, on the street. How does it stack up to where it started? And how does it stack up against many of the other vehicles we've driven? So total in parts, depending on how you want to look at this car, the car starts in the low 30s with the premium package and the manual. And all the suspension components alone and brakes are like $5,000 or $6,000. Wheels and tires are another $2,000 to $3,000. So this is almost a $40,000 car now. How does it compete or compare with vehicles?
It's an absolute waste of money. I mean, there's nothing against the parts. The parts perform as expected. They did everything they were supposed to do in the dry, in the perfect temperature, on the track. But on the street, well, yes, the dampers improve the overall compliance and handling of the car. The price plus the issues you had, not only with alignment, clunks from the top hats, all the bullshit that you have to deal with aftermarket suspension, putting on rear camber arms, finding the right balance of alignment, street, and then having to change it for track, having to change brake pads to make the car tolerable on the street versus the track. I mean, it's all the bullshit you have to do. This is not something I would ever recommend doing for somebody that's driving this every single day. This is not what you do on a daily driving car, because the end result is too much fucking around. Way too much fucking around. And you can do the same shit on the stock car. Honestly, you can do the same stuff here. It feels almost identical.
Yeah, so as a street car, right, there are lots of cons. Everything you've just said is accurate, right? The suspension makes more noise than it used to. You have to constantly swap pads, which, to be fair, you have to do in a regular car anyway.
Yeah.
And you are now chasing problems. The problem with these cars, and it happened with your FRS from 10 years ago, in the winter, the top hats and the camber arms, or when you street drive them, shift the alignment, and I'm chasing toe problems here and there.
Yeah.
I will say the dampers, to your point, do ride much better than they used to. They handle big bumps and little bumps far better than the stock shocks do. They just do. And in the winter, I'm not really finding any real penalties, but
as we talked, when I did my original video with Oleans, the first thing they said is high performance parts require high performance maintenance. You have less seal stiction, you have all the things that go into a shock like this, they still have to be rebuilt.
Yes.
They're not gonna last 10 years and have the same performance. So, you're sending these shocks out. If you're driving this car in the winter with the Essex brakes, you're having to send the calipers out to get ultrasonic cleaning, to have the seals, internal seals rebuilt if you have a lot of salt and dirt in them. I mean,
yeah, basically once we're done here, I'm parking this car because of it.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just being honest about it. If you have the tolerance, you have nothing else to do in your life, and you don't work a lot where all you want to do is tinker with a car, then
or you want to build a $40,000 performance car.
So, I mean, I'm talking about street. You already covered the track. So that's my opinion on it.
So as a track car, though, with your opinions, getting back to the dynamic part of this vehicle, $40,000, you can buy a lot of car. You can buy an Elantra N, you can almost get a GR Corolla, you can almost get a Golf R, you almost get your CTR.
Yeah, well, I mean, not right now.
Not right now, but you can get an old CTR. How does this compare to those cars on track or when you're driving it hard?
It's a real rear-wheel drive car, and you could call it a sports car because of its layout. I've seen these arguments that hatchbacks and these hot hatches and all those sedans are not real sports cars. Well, I feel like this is much closer in terms of what a sports car should be because of the layout. I would say driving it is a very special experience on the street and the track. It's only let down, of course, by the engine. Is just so lackluster. It makes way more power than the last car. It makes so much more power that you don't need to modify it, in my opinion. And you notice it on track, namely compared to the S2000, which makes essentially very similar wheel horsepower to this car now, like the AP2. And the fact that just with these modifications compared to the S2000,
dramatically faster.
It's dramatically faster. We're talking 4 seconds a lap faster on Autobahn, and of course that might shrink to 3 seconds.
Maybe even 2, but it's a big difference.
No, it would never shrink to 2 seconds, but 3 to 4 seconds depending on the day. That is a huge difference. This car is faster all the time. It's more aero balanced. It's more neutral. It does everything better. It just doesn't have the emotional highs of a high revving engine, like a real good high revving engine.
And it doesn't have the same ability to load up the front and the rear because of the double wishbone suspension.
Yeah, that you get it. You're still saddled with the strut, but the aftermarket support here is so good that it really doesn't matter. It's still a great car. This really is probably one of the best cars you can buy for an affordable price, other than a Elantra N, which is the front wheel drive equivalent. This is a special car because of that, and that's kind of where I'll leave it.
I want to ask you one more question about the S2000, because though this series didn't quite pan out the way I had planned, compared to the S2000, how does this car differ? As a driving experience, yes, it's more practical. Yes, you have back seats and a bigger trunk, but when you're behind the wheel, you don't drive a lap time. You don't drive a dyno sheet or really abstract engineering behind the wheel. Why do you prefer the S2000 to this?
I prefer the S2000 for basically 3 or 4 specific reasons. It's a more visceral car. It's a little bit harder to drive at the limit. It has a better engine and transmission combo. And because you can put the top down, it just gives you a more connected feel to the vehicle. It has that older feel where there's a lot more going on in terms of the seat of the pants experience than this. And that's exactly what makes the S2000 bad as a daily driver, like a car that you could buy to drive all the time. Because this is more refined, there's real room in it, all the practical considerations this fixes, and it has way better aerodynamics. So the S2000 will always be let down by the fact that it's aero dirty. The back end is unstable until you start doing ridiculous aero with huge wings in the back, front splitters. You have to do all of that stuff to make that car fast, and then the fact that you have to start really to compete with a car like this, you're having to do engine tuning or blowers and all that. If you take the S2000 as a stock car and this car is a stock car, the emotional highs are higher in the S2000 than this, but this is overall a completely better car.
I think I agree with you. One of the things that we've seen from other journalists, without naming them, they complain that the S2000 isn't a great car to drive on the street. Right?
Yeah.
It's not that exciting.
Right.
I think I agree with them on that point. But to your point, the high element, like when you're on the track, when you're on an amazing back road, and you load up the S2000, you're driving it at that 10 or 9/10.
Yeah.
There's no better four-cylinder sports car in the world.
No, it's amazing. You know, it really is. But you have to drive it at the limit, which means you're basically on the track or on some like really
ridiculous
complicated road that doesn't exist for 90% of people. So it's a very hard car. It's a special car in its space because of that. That the this 86 and all the variants, this car does not have that. It does not have that. You don't ever feel that way. It's just easier to drive. It's faster to drive. You're not having to work it as much. But they're unique in their own little worlds of the era they're built in. And I would say you should probably try to own both and drive both to experience them because they are special for their price.
Okay, Mark, with that, I think it's time for us to head into the shop so we can continue this long and dragged out video.
Yeah.
As promised, this is a long video, so the next step of this journey is to go to Chicago Auto Pros. About a year ago, I wrapped this thing, I paint corrected it to show you whether or not wrapping a vehicle is worth the money and actually going to protect this car, particularly if you follow the correct steps of not running it through a meat grinder, washing it by hand, being careful with it. So let's see how it held up. We're back at Chicago Auto Pros to walk through how my car has held up over the last 11 months. It's December and this car was wrapped last January. And as a recap, you did the full front clip of PPF, it's XPEL film.
Yeah.
You did a ceramic coating and a light paint correction to actually show you a good before and after. It's had track days, it's been driven through the winter. I've driven it on road trips, on the highway, on Chicago roads. So it's probably one of the worst places you could possibly own a car, but walk me through how it's held up.
After a year, how many miles do you have on it?
About 10,000.
Okay, cool. And it's funny, we've seen a lot of cars come in here after a year and it looks like they're almost 10 years old, you know? And that's the whole point of this. We put all the protection products on there. We did everything we possibly can do to reduce the risk of this getting scratches and chips and everything. So we put the clear bra on there and we actually looked at the front end here and you got a couple chips on there, but they're in the clear bra, which is a sacrificial layer, right? And normally when we see cars that are driven as much as you drive on the highway and everything, we can actually see them and there'll be paint missing on them. A lot of rock chips. And what's nice about this clear bra is that it absorbs most of those smaller impacts, right?
Yes.
And you got a couple bigger ones here, but there's only a couple where you can see that there's actually some almost missing clear bra, like a chip in that sacrificial layer, but you pull that off and it's gonna be brand new underneath.
And I think some of this as well, as we talked about in some of our other videos we shot with one another, is actually doing the proper maintenance. So don't run these cars through a meat grinder.
Yep.
Don't scratch the paint when you're washing it yourself. So I've only had this washed either by them or by myself by hand very carefully. And how has the rest of the car held up? Obviously the front has a nice little dent and we're gonna show how PDR works on PPF film. But as we walk through the rest of the vehicle, you do have a couple tar spots from tires and all that other fun stuff. How is that going to be to bring that back to a clean state?
Very easy, because we've done all these things. Like you can literally, we've gone with the flashlight and looked, and because of the self-healing of the paint protection film, like there is virtually nothing on the front end of your car. It looks scratch-free, there's no swirls. You get back to the back, you have very minor swirls, right? Yeah. You've been doing proper hand washes, and this car looks glossy. It doesn't look faded. There's no heavy swirls or scratches in it. It looks new, and this is the consistent behavior that we want for cars to, like, we would love this car in 5 years, in 10 years to still look new, versus having a car that's 1 or 2 years old look like a 10-year-old car.
Because these aren't disposable products to someone. Someone who's going to buy this car more normally is going to keep it for 5 years, maybe longer.
Yeah.
You want to protect your, I hate to call it an investment, but your large sum of money you've just spent on an automobile.
Yeah.
I guess we're going to show the differences between, say, maintaining things that have been covered. Obviously, the front clips have some tar on them,
right,
versus, say, the back where the rear wheels are.
So we'll do a wash, and we every year or so we do a little more in a wash. We call it a decon. So anything that is stuck to the paint that doesn't come off with normal washing, right? Like sap or tar, or in your case, you got some rubber on the sides and everything that has kind of left a little bit of streaking. Those are things that we have to go above and beyond, and we can remove with either chemical decontamination or physical clay bar decontamination. We'll show you how to do that.
Is there any difference between how that's done on PPF paneled versus non?
For the most part, no. You treat your paint protection film like normal clear coat. You can do a lot of the things that you would do to normal paint, wash it, all that stuff, just the same.
So with paintless dent repair, there's two options of being able to fix it, is getting tools from the backside and reshaping the metal back into place, or pulling it from the top side. When you have paint protection film on it, you kind of can't pull from the top side because you're really risk damaging the PPF. And if you damage it, then it has to get replaced, and that's just extra cost and waste that doesn't need to be taken care of. Certain dents can be fixed with PPF on it. Usually shallow stuff that's a little bit softer and not as sharp and pointy. Sharp and pointier dents are harder to repair.
Okay, final thoughts. Well, it's been a year. We've done a lot to this car, and as it sits, is basically a $40,000 car now, which makes it expensive. Do I think it is worth all of that money? Well, I'm gonna give you sort of a mixed answer. Yes and no. While clearly it is actually a great car to drive on track now, Britt Casey prefers driving this to something like a Supra or a New Z, which speaks a lot to the parts, the platform, and the modification strategy we went with. But at $40,000, if you're looking for pure lap times, you can go buy a C5 Z06, a new or slightly used SS1LE, and annihilate this car. So purely from a lap time perspective, there are better options. But again, you don't drive a lap time. It's a new car that you can buy today with a warranty. You don't have to modify it to this degree to have a good time with it. As Mark said, all you really need to do is do some brake pads, brake fluid, and potentially wheels and tires, and you have a very fun car to drive, and that's the thing I enjoy about this vehicle. While it is far from perfect, while it is not the best sports car in the world, it gives you so much for your money, and theoretically it's a car you can actually buy, which is a great thing. I'm very happy that Toyota built this car, and it's been a fun year living with this thing. I don't know how much longer I'm gonna keep it with, but I can assure you we will be doing a final wrap-up video before I dump this thing. So with that, thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon.